there's an observation that puzzled me over a number of years. Maybe you have the answer for it. There must be some kind of economics behind this, where you go into restaurants, they serve you salad at a lot more money than they do meat. Well, there's no process involved, there's no labor as much as you produce the meat. So what is the purpose behind that?
Well, I'm not sure quite what you're asking, but I do know that there's a tremendous amount of subsidies that go into lowering the cost of meat to the consumer, what it really should be. If you took into account the environment, for example, Gene mentioned that we pay them, the producers, pork production facilities are notorious for this. They don't know what to do with the waste. They've got a tremendous number of pigs concentrated in a very small area. These animals produce a lot of waste, and they don't know what to do with it. They're nowhere near the farms growing the grain fed to these animals, so it can't be, it's not economical to spread it on the land producing their feed, because that's hundreds, thousands of miles away. So they don't know what to do with it, and it basically becomes a huge contaminant. And so the federal government gives them all kinds of money to try to correct the problem, which doesn't work. There really isn't a solution. The problem is we've confined these animals in egregious concentration levels. The stocking densities are deplorable. It's a crime against nature. It's a crime against the animals. It's a crime against our compassion. And I often think about our liberties and our right to live in a compassionate world, to see our public policies and our industrial policies and our agricultural systems reflect our love for life, our gratitude to be participants in this earth community, and to treat it with regard, and if possible, even reverence. But instead, these are food production facilities or pork production facilities that conflict at every level with any kind of humanity. And the consequences is all this pollution, and then we pay them. We pay them constantly because they're polluting everything, and we give them more money to try to correct the problem, and then we give them more money, and we give them more money. We give them all these price supports. And it ends up for the consumer at the restaurant, you know, it's cheap. Or a McDonald's hamburger is really cheap, or a Burger King is really cheap. There's so much that's gone into lowering that price by externalizing the costs. Do you know what I mean when I say externalize? It's a very important concept, where they, instead of the costs of production being borne in the cost of purchasing the product, they're externalized, they're deflected, they're elsewhere, onto society, onto the future, onto health care costs. We have a food system that knows nothing about health and is completely unconcerned about our health. We have a healthcare system that's completely unconcerned about our food, you know, because actually they profit. The drug companies are actually happy. It fits with their business model when you're ill and need their products. Surgeons do surgery. I'm not saying surgeons want you to be unhealthy, but that's where their livelihood is, and on throughout the system. There really isn't anybody making money off of you being well. And if someone invents a new drug to treat high blood pressure, there are billions of dollars that can be made. If someone's teaching people to eat and live so that their blood pressure is low to begin with and stays so throughout their lives, that's not profitable. So we have some pretty perverse incentives operating. And speaking of blood pressure, since I did mention it, the gentleman who's 68, are you? And you've been a vegan for 7 years. You look really great. And I'm 66. I just had a birthday. And I've been aware of men our age. You know, I don't know how you are. Old, 51. Kid. A youngin'. Precocious. You started really young. Got there right away. You know, it's never too late, as you example shows. And I'm watching men my age become you know, older, and I'm seeing the chickens come home to roost in a lot of cases. My blood pressure is 95/60, and that's without any drugs. And my, when I had it last taken, the doctor said, "You have the blood pressure of a 17-year-old." And he says, "You are the best argument for your diet I've ever seen." and I think that actually matters. I think that what happens to people when they eat a particular way over time really matters. And I want to live well as long as I'm alive. I want to be healthy and vital and vibrant. And so far, so good. I'm still running marathons. And the possibility that we could eat in a way that would dramatically lower our medical costs, dramatically, exists. That possibility really does exist. It's a realistic potential. And I'm working very hard, I know probably a lot of you are too, to see our society take advantage of that opportunity.
And I'll just add on, I agree with all that these are perverse incentives. And I think they're based on this assumption that eating meat is good somehow. That's sort of the underlying notion. And I think it's a myth that has driven food policy. And then you have institutions that form around that, like the medical profession, the whole pharmaceutical industry. And then those are, vested in maintaining the status quo. And yes, so there are price supports to keep the price cheap of meat, but there are externalities, as John was saying, and they're very costly over time. It's just a matter of looking at it that way. And the price we pay at the grocery store is not the full price. We're paying for it in other ways.
I want to give one example of this subject. In the Farm Bill, there's a tremendous amount, many tens of billions of dollars, that goes to support the production of genetically engineered soy and corn. These are massive plantations. We're talking 90 million acres of corn right now and 80 million acres of soy, all genetically, or 95% of it genetically engineered. It's not going to tofu and tortillas, This is livestock feed. And in the case of corn, also to ethanol. The vast majority of it is going to feed animals in factory farms and feedlots. And when you lower that price of, you subsidize those crops, then you get those crops. And then the factory farm industry purchases them at almost no cost. We actually are, as a taxpayer base, paying for the food fed to our livestock. It's terrible food. It is genetically engineered. These are diets that are alien to the metabolism of these creatures. They are designed not to keep them healthy, but to fatten them up as fast as possible without regard to the impact on their health, because they're going to die pretty quickly anyway. They're going to get killed. They live very short lives. But the idea is just get them as fat as possible, as quickly as possible. Now, when you think about people eating the flesh and the products from those animals who have been fed a diet systematically designed to make them as fat as possible, as quickly as possible, and then you see we have this rampant obesity in our society. You maybe are what they ate.
I really appreciate what both of you guys are up to. I think it's really important. I've known about the farming agribusiness for a long time, since I was young. And I have a question. I'm wondering if you could speak to how we've seen a lot of big changes in the last 5 years in laws, like equality of marriage, like marriage equality for gays, and then also like don't ask, don't tell, and then the decriminalization of marijuana, and then the Affordable Care Act. And those are things that have just like flipped in the last 5 years. And I noticed that some of those have been impacted by choice regulation straight from the top, like the Affordable Care Act. The most of America still doesn't really support that. On the other hand, like marriage equality or the decriminalization of marijuana basically was a grassroots, some came out of Hollywood, but basically America's population started accepting these things, and they kind of grew up and they're like, well, okay, I guess you can get married, fine. And so I'm noticing that it hasn't been shifting that way with food, and I'm wondering, should we start going, oh, wait, let's start taking this down from the top? And I know it's both sides. Or is there a way to make this more pressing and interesting to consumers? And what's happening there? Is it mostly working from the top? Is it mostly going to come from the bottom? And is organics and whole foods and farmers markets really the source of the tip? Or is that really just something that's sort of growing and it needs to come from somewhere else?
Well, I want to say one quick thing, then I'll give it to you, Gene. When you mentioned legalization of gay marriage and decriminalization in some states of marijuana, both of those occurred, in the election in November of 2012. Colorado legalized. There's 2 states that legalized marijuana, Washington and Colorado, and there were several states that legalized gay marriage at that time. And I actually thought there was a reason that those 2 things occurred at the same moment, if you will bear with me for a moment. We've just been misreading the Bible. In Leviticus, it says, if a man shall lie with another man, they should be stoned. I couldn't resist. I'm sorry.
I love that, man. Well, I mean, I think that, recently there have been some big lurches forward in some areas. And I think in the food area, there have been some lurches forward, too, not nearly as pronounced. And it's, and with the food industry, it is just so entrenched. And so I think change is going to happen more slowly. But I think the fact that farmers markets are growing is very positive. Community-supported agriculture programs are growing. That's very positive. The number of land animals being consumed in the U.S. actually started going down in 2008. Now, unfortunately, that's been countered by the number of fish being consumed going up. And there's also aquaculture, and that's a whole other problem right now. But I think there's more awareness. We have YouTube, we have Facebook, we have social networks. People don't like factory farming when they hear about it. Even people like Anthony Bourdain, who is certainly no friend to animals, has said that what happens on the factory farm is borders on the criminal. So we have this kind of widespread awareness now, and people do want something different, but there are not the current infrastructure to exist right now to do it. I think it's going to happen more grassroots, but as a way of an example of that is there's a strong demand for alternatives to factory farmed foods. For most people, they still think meat, unfortunately, so they're buying things labeled as free range. But there are not many farms that are actually treating animals very well. So you have standards pushed down because that's the infrastructure in place and the supply is bad. And there are also entrepreneurs now, though, small businesses coming up with farming operations and new food systems. So it's very early, but there needs to be an alternative, and it's a functional alternative. Some of these other things, there's maybe the infrastructure in place, like with marijuana, for example, and there's a supply, and it's just a matter of changing the policy. With the food, there's a whole machinery of supplying it, and that is slowly starting to shift. And one thing on the vegan area, there's plant-based milks now available with soybeans and stuff that some of these big dairy companies are part of. So that's an example where it's widely available because you kind of have the machinery behind it. But with farmers markets, that's more localized, and that, in my view, is really the ideal scenario. Farmers markets, CSAs, where consumers are more in touch with their food, but that then involves kind of habit changes, and those happen a little more slowly sometimes.
We're working very hard at the Food Revolution Network to ignite, to mobilize people, to really make these changes and join a CSA and go to a farmer's market and buy organic food and be I use the phrase plant strong diet. I used to use the word vegan. More and more I use the word plant strong. I just want to completely subvert the assumption that we're eating rabbit food. That just you're going to be weak. It's so not true. If you think having heart disease is sexy, fine. But I think having a vital life and a creative mind that's cognitively lucid throughout your life is sexy. I think being brilliant and honoring the genius within and expressing it and welcoming it in everyone you meet, I think that's sexy. I think they always talk about meat being real food for real people, and Neil Barnard once said, well, if you're going to eat that way, you better live real close to a real good hospital. It's amazing, actually, and the work of some marvelous physicians and researchers. I'm thinking of Dean Ornish and Caldwell Esselstyn and Colin Campbell. These are really top of the line scientists and medical professionals. And they have shown, using the most scrupulous scientific methodology, that a plant-strong diet reverses heart disease, prevents heart disease, lowers risk of cancer, dramatically lowers risk of cancer, in many cases arrests cases of cancer, in some cases actually starts to reverse them. These dietary changes are powerful. They are medically powerful. And I think that knowledge, that reality needs to be as spread as widely as possible. We're trying to do that. I know Gene's doing that. And I'm glad that we have this opportunity to share it with you so you can do it. And talk to the people that get informed, read the books, watch the documentaries, join the groups, whatever, feed people good food that nourishes their souls, their bodies, their cells, their minds, so they can live magnificent lives. That's how we're going to do this, I think.
Separate but related questions. The first, you were talking about, of course, growing organic and eating organic. Farmers markets are wonderful. I've often thought the best idea is to have neighborhood gardens and people growing their own at home. Not everyone can do that, but at least a neighborhood garden. But my concern, and I try to stay extremely positive about this, but I know the facts, and the facts are that I've read in a number of towns they're actually outlawing people growing gardens. And there's Codex Alimentarius, which we don't need to get all into, but I read an article this week which blew me away in New Zealand that they're actually making a law, and some people are fighting it, grassroots, and this seems to me it's all grassroots. That law that people are still fighting, it says in New Zealand, no more people can grow gardens at home. It's like, what? And it's happening in this country too in certain towns.
When laws like that get proposed, it's always big ag behind it. Who's offended by community gardens?
Right.
There are laws in some communities, some homeowners associations in particular, that require you to have a lawn. And if someone starts to pull up the lawn and put in a vegetable garden, there's people have been put in jail for that in one of some of these places. This is the wrong use of government. This is the wrong use of. We didn't come together to agree to do that. It's just ridiculous. In fact, it's so absurd that you'd think at some point the absurdity would collapse it.
Right.
I think sometimes, one of the other questioners' or statements had to do with we've had seen growth and progress around gay issues. And I think part of that is cultural. We've got shows like Glee, and Ellen DeGeneres, and there's certain, it kind of becomes normalized in a way. What had been seen as, not that long ago, the diagnostic manual actually classified homosexuality as a mental illness. Fortunately, we don't do that anymore. But you can see we've come a long ways. I think there's going to be a cultural shift. It's going to come from culture around meat and health. I don't think it can happen without that. And I actually want you to know, I've been invited, I'm so excited about this. in a few weeks, James Cameron, who is the producer of Titanic and Avatar, the most successful Hollywood producer and director in history, has become a vegan and a vegan advocate. He's long been very concerned about global warming. He has come to the conclusion, he and his people at the Avatar Foundation, that the if we could reduce meat consumption, that's the most important thing we can do, not only to improve public health, but also, and this is where his real energy is with, lower our carbon footprint, our methane footprint, the other greenhouse gas footprint, and start to slow down this runaway problem that is of immense proportions. And I'm going to be meeting with him. The people, Caldwell Esselstyn, Dean Ornish, myself, and T. Colin Campbell are meeting with him in a few weeks for a series of meetings. He has the resources, financially and otherwise. I don't know what he's got in mind. I'll find out. I'm glad. I'm loving being with those people at that meeting with him. If he decides to make a movie about it, it's liable to be pretty effective. The man knows how to make movies. And he knows a lot of people in the industry. And I'm looking, and I don't know what will come of this meeting, although it's very promising. There are other people waking up to this issue. One of the founders of Twitter, Biz Stone, is a vegan. There are people in very significant positions who are waking up to this issue. And guys like us who've been in the trenches for a long, long time, you know, are really glad to see this. And eager to help, and eager to see, curious as can be to see what comes of it.
So do you think it's more grassroots, or do you think it's more when the, you know?
All of the above and more.
Okay, so I have another question, because I think about this a lot, and like we have friends on the East Coast, family, Midwest, you know, people in the North. I mean, in California, it's easy to grow a garden, even in the winter, you know, we can grow winter vegetables. But what about when people don't live where things can grow easily? How do, you know, we want to eat local, but they can't.
You know, California is great in terms of the climate. There's enormous, you know, opportunities for produce here. But, you know, when I went to Michigan State that I mentioned earlier, at the student-run garden, they actually had hoop houses, and they were growing greens in the middle of winter in East Lansing, Michigan. So this is where this is, I think, a good use of technology. And there are ways to do it. It's not as easy, but there are ways to greenhouses. And then, and that one was not heated either by any petroleum. It was just heated by the sun, and the way they designed it, it worked. And then there's also things like canning and ways to preserve food that we've used for hundreds or thousands of years that we could revisit. So this is again part of, and then root cellars, you know, keeping root cellars is another, you know, tried and true way of preserving food over the course of the winters.
I lived in British Columbia for 15 years, from 69 to 84, and we grew during those 15 years most of our own food. And we did it. It's cold. Winters are, you got a short growing season, and we became very grateful to the plant kale. Yes. Kale, a particular variety that we would plant, Siberian kale, is extremely hardy. And we'd go out in the winter, and it was freezing, lots of snow, and just knock the snow off the leaves. And you know, we'd plant it in summer, grow through fall, and then it'd be out there through the winter and spring until it warmed up, and then plants went to seed. But throughout the cold time, we had fresh kale every single day. And that's just one example of what can be done. That plant is hardy to 40 below. It just doesn't grow at that temperature, but it sustains itself at that temperature. And it happens, ironically, or magically, or maybe there's a principle involved in this. Kale is about as healthy a plant, is as high in nutrients, it's dark green leafy vegetable, as there is. And so if you could only have one plant, and that's the one that grows and survives and is happy in that kind of temperature. And I'm sure we also did other things with carrots and parsnips, and we had a root cellar, and you learn to do these things. It does take time. Growing your own food takes a lot more time than people. We're so convenience oriented, you know, and we go to the market and we just pay and it's all there. Except that the nutrition isn't there. The food is older. It's not as tasty, and it's not as nutrient full as fresh food. And when you grow it yourself, yes, it does take some time, and you may have to give up some of the distractive behaviors that we're all addicted to and that become the cultural norm, but aren't healthy. And you start to grow food and get your hands in the dirt, and your life starts to feel better in a whole lot of ways. That we just have to, but some of us are addicted to media and instant stimulation and instant gratification, and our attention span is collapsed in so many ways. And this is actually, gardening is a way to expand your attention capabilities and start to be in rhythm with the earth and rejoin the earth and reconnect and send your roots down into the earth. And then not only do your plants thrive, but your soul does too.
I work on a farm in the Sierra foothills. It's a small farm, and we raise some cows as well as vegetables. And I was just I actually had kind of two questions. One was, I guess, what is your opinion on like raising cows or animals for meat that is truly in a way that is grass-fed, local, organic, and you're treating the animals well. And the other question, which is kind of unrelated, but I was interested in hearing, what is your vision like for the future and what you would like to see the food future and the world future be? Thanks.
What's your vision? We'll make that your closing statement.
Yeah, well, in terms of raising cows and letting them live outdoors and have a good life, I mean, that's certainly way better than like feedlots and all that, you know. But at a certain point when it comes time to kill them, you know, that's an area that there's an inherent violence there that I don't think we need to participate in. You know, that would be my view on that. And so I guess I'll just say that.
Well, I know that there's a lot of people that want meat and want animal foods, and so people like you who are providing them in a better way are doing a service, I think, to all of us to help us move in the right direction. I'm not going to buy it myself because I really try to honor my conscience, and my conscience speaks to me about that every living being has a right to live, and as much as I do. And if that animal draws breath from the same source as I do, and if it, I don't want it to be killed so I can eat. If there's other food that I can eat, so that's my conscience, that's my ethics, that's my morality, and I don't assume that that's yours or anybody else's. But I think what's most important is that we be supported in living in accord with our ethics and values and heart purpose, whatever that is. I'm not trying to tell anyone where to draw the line. I'll tell you where I draw it, but you can't draw it honestly, though, if you don't have accurate information. And we're all fed so much bull, in both senses of the word. And we're indoctrinated. There's this cultural trance. You need meat for strength. You need animal protein to get adequate. And you really do for the purposes of their profits. But you don't. Medical science is showing us that. There may be some people who have some need. I don't know. We're all a little bit different. But the movement towards a more plant-strong diet and away from industrial agriculture, the movement to local food and healthy food and sustainable food, I think we need a Department of Homegrown Security. I really do. I think we have now, and this is my vision too, and we have very long supply chains. Our food system is totally predicated on petroleum, cheap petroleum, by which we transport food and food resources that make food production possible huge distances. And those distances, as the cost of petroleum increases, that's all going to become less sustainable. It's also, those long supply chains are susceptible to rupture for a variety of reasons, in a whole bunch of ways. And so it's not really secure. When food is more local, it's not only healthier, it's not only greener in the sense of the carbon footprint being reduced, but it's also more stable. It's more secure. And in the coming years, that's going to become increasingly important. My vision is that we do have the kind of biosecurity that we would have with more people being close to the land on which their food is grown. That's why if you get to know a farmer and join a CSA, you know what a CSA is? And you join a CSA, you then have a relationship to that farmer and that land. It may not be quite as convenient as shopping at Whole Foods. It may be equally, it may not save you a lot of money, but it's starting to build a relationship for you with the farmer and the land that is producing the food that you depend on. And that is worth more than we may recognize it, because we don't have a way of monetizing it. We tend to only recognize what we can monetize as having value. And when we do that, we impoverish ourselves, I think, very deeply. You know, if you say someone in our society, if you say someone's a success, they've been a successful human person, doesn't that usually mean they just have made a lot of money? That's the way we use the word success. We define it in exclusively financial terms. And I think that is a terrible spiritual error. I think it has real ramifications, because I think a successful person, whatever the numbers in their bank account, is someone who uses their gifts and resources to make the world a better place. You know, who brings out the goodness in others, who sees, recognizes, and welcomes the spirit of goodness in all the people they meet, and contributes something to the well-being of the whole Earth community and its future. So that is not about money, though if you have it and you use it that way, glory be.
I completely agree with the idea of consumers getting much closer to producers, because the further there's a disconnect, geographically and otherwise, the less we are going to make informed, mindful choices. And ideally, even growing some of our own food would be wonderful. In terms of the broad vision, there's the notion of the Garden of Eden, this kind of idea. And there's a question, can it even exist? I don't know. But it's an aspiration to live in a way where we're not causing harm to others, to live in a way that we can feel good about, to live in a way that is healthy. And, the earth gives us so much. We can, like kale. That's a great example of kale, And it is there. These are gifts to be grateful for and to appreciate. And other people and animals in our lives are also gifts to appreciate as teachers. And we can learn much more from living creatures than from dead ones. And to appreciate that and to revel in that. And in this sort of Garden of Eden dream, that would be the aspiration. And, just to live in a way that doesn't cause harm. And I think more and more people want to do that. More and more people are doing that. And I completely agree with the point that, money is not a measure of success. I mean, in some cases, it could be even the opposite. And living well and expressing oneself, and for different people, it's going to be different things. Working with animals, I see animals who've been prevented from expressing themselves, and that's a crime in a sense. And farmers who do things that they don't feel good about, that's a crime in a sense. People eating in a way that makes ourselves sick, that's a crime in a way, So I think just living in a way that is in alliance with our best selves, our best angels, is sort of the dream that I have.